Okay, so now we've looked at an introductory overview of special education. Let's take a look at the institutions that are involved in providing services for children with special needs. So Chapter 2 is entitled Children with Exceptionalities and Social Institutions, and it covers the three institutions that implement those programs in the United States, and that's government, schools, and then the courts. So societal responses to children with exceptionalities. In the historical process, of course, as we mentioned in the introductory chapter, was rejection, and then there was a more charitable approach, and then there was isolation, and then more today, we're looking at making people with special needs and exceptionalities more contributing members of society. Before World War II, there were limited services for some children with sensory disabilities or physical impairments provided by some states. And after World War II, there was an expansion in services to other disability categories. For example, problems of personal scarcity and variation in services from state to state. So the role of government is they provide a vehicle for change through legislation. And legislation means a legal requirement for educators to follow. Federal legislation went against the American tradition of education. And that tradition actually is that the responsibility for education was provided at the state and local government level. But the federal legislation for special education required it to happen all across the country. Parent groups were instrumental in pushing for federal legislation. So Public Law 88 1-164, and what those numbers mean, it was the 88th Congress, and it was Bill number 164 that they considered, was passed in 1963. And this authorized funds for training professionals to work with children with special needs, and for research and demonstration of best practices for children with intellectual and developmental delays and deafness. Public Law 94-142 was passed in 1975, and this was actually the first federal law that required that children provided services through public education. It's also known as the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And it was designed to assure a free and appropriate public education for all children, including those with exceptionalities that are elementary school age. And by the way, the acronym for free and appropriate public education is FAPE, or FAPE, and that this essentially means that parents can't be charged an extra fee to enroll their children in public education. This law also included requirements for assessment, parental contact, and student evaluation. So the Education for All Handicapped Children Act also meant that no one could be rejected. Everyone had to be provided with a free and public education. They were entitled to a non-discriminatory evaluation. In other words, no matter what their special need was, they couldn't be discriminated against in regards to evaluation. Once that evaluation was completed, then an individualized education program would be created, or an IEP is the acronym. This program would be implemented in the least restrictive environment, or LRE, and this is the best environment for each individual child to learn in. And then if parents felt like their rights were not being met, they had the right of due process. In other words, they could go to court and make sure that the public school was providing them with their rights. And then parents were guaranteed that they should be part of this whole process and participate in that. Public Law 99-457 was passed in 1986, and this amended the Education for All Handicapped Children Act and provided services not just for children elementary school age, but from birth to school age. And the title of the law changed to Individuals with Disabilities Act, and we should add Education Act, or IDEA, and that's the acronym. And then this was reauthorized in 2004, and here this strengthened and improved earlier versions, guaranteeing that there were quality personnel working in special education. It improved the individualized education program standards. It required transition planning, and specifically starting at age 16, but also planning to move from preschool to elementary school, from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school. And it provided funding for special education supports such as professional training. There are other forms of legislation that guarantee access for everyone. One is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was actually a law that was passed for adults, but can be utilized for children who don't qualify for an IEP under IDEA. And this is Public Law 93-112. And this provides children who don't qualify for an IEP, which would be children who have ADHD without any other special needs, and that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This provides opportunities for classroom accommodations for children who don't otherwise receive services. And so rather than having an IEP, they would have a 504 accommodation plan. Also in 1992, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was passed, Public Law 101-336, and this provided a legal requirement for equal access of everyone to all public facilities, and this expands the requirement for providing services for children with special needs to private education programs, not just public. So No Child Left Behind, which is something we don't hear about much anymore. This was passed in 2001. It wasn't targeted specifically for exceptional children, but it provided, it caused some issues, and it's why it's a problem, and it has kind of fallen by the wayside, and the name of that law has been changed to some extent. So right now in California, instead of No Child Left Behind, it's called Success for All Students Act. And so this law, part of the problem was that it required testing to ensure that all students meet standards, and the goal was 100% proficiency. It was problematic for many students with special needs who were unable to gain an academic year of growth each year. And failure to meet this standard had consequences for students, teachers, and schools. And so that's part of the reason why that we've changed our perspective on that law. Okay, so that's the legislative or government aspect of it. The role of courts. The court is another institution, and remember that the law provided the right to due process, and that's where the courts come in. Courts rule on interpretations of laws, and they provide recourse when rights are violated. And so class action lawsuits mean one case affects all individuals in a class, such as all children with special needs. So because of this due process right, there are many court cases, and there are trends of how those court cases fell. So in the 1970s and 80s, many of those cases focused on the free and appropriate education aspect of special education laws. In the 1990s, there was an increase in cases addressing the issue of inclusion and the least restrictive environment aspect of the law. And recently, court cases have focused on the question of whether or not a student's IEP was correctly designed or implemented, especially looking at whether parents are involved in the development of individualized education programs. Courts have repeatedly endorsed the participation of parents in the free and appropriate education that their children receive. So the third institution is schools. So the role of schools, there are 5 tasks that schools face in meeting the needs of children with special needs. First, they have to find the children with special needs and identify and specify the special need that each child has. They need to organize programming to meet those needs, and they need to provide that programming and make sure that it works, and then facilitate a transition of that child or individual into the community at the end of the schooling process. And so currently the focus is on accountability. Are educators doing what they said they would do? And then balance between the individualized instructions and then access to general curriculum. So some key elements to help schools reach high expectations. Some research that was done in 2011 said that schools need to take ownership of these high expectations. They need to have strong intervention systems. They need to incorporate inclusion wherever it fits and collaborative teaching. And there needs to be organizational and professional development to help staff implement all of these aspects. Incorporating these can help schools meet the needs of all students. So then, how do they find children with special needs? Well, first, students are referred for special education services for many reasons, most frequently by a teacher who feels that the child differs significantly from their peers in a way affecting learning. Screening tests are administered to all students in the early grades, and this may also be a basis for referral. And then pre-referral committees help establish if a child is simply having difficulty adjusting or if his difficulties warrant further evaluation. So these are ways that children with special needs can be found. Then the assessing and planning process Sometimes there needs to be organizational changes or changes in the learning environment and the personnel working with a child, instructional changes, changes to the curriculum and instructional strategies, and then developing an individualized education program, a contract. This is a contract outlining students' individualized needs, and then a plan for action to meet those needs. IEPs should be written by teams, including the school personnel that will be working with the child, and then the child's parents or guardians. So in this planning, instruction needs to be adapted to meet the needs of students in many ways. They may adapt the learning environment, they may adapt the curriculum, they may adapt the teaching strategies, or use assistive and instructional technology. In an individualized education program, some of the features that you'll find are the child's present level of performance, some yearly goals, how success for these yearly goals will be measured, types of special education and related services that will be provided, how the academic program will be modified and supported, how inclusion fits into the academic program, behavior intervention plans if they're appropriate, and then a transition plan if that's appropriate. And then the aspect of adapting the learning environment. Inclusion would be an educational philosophy based on the idea that children with exceptionalities should be a part of the general education environment. And then the least restrictive environment aspect, or LRE, this is the educational concept that children with exceptionalities should be educated in the setting that maximizes the chances that they will meet educational goals. And sometimes that's in the general education environment, and sometimes it's not. And so identifying special needs, here again is that information processing model we talked about in Chapter 1. This can be useful in identifying a child with special needs. And remember, this one's looking at the emotional context, and then cognitive, executive functioning, focusing on attention, thinking, and then response. And so then collaboration and support services. This is a team effort and a team game. There should be co-teaching, team teaching, the special education teacher and the general classroom teacher collaborate to make sure that all children are in an inclusive classroom. The classroom aide has a role in the education process as well. And then support services assist and prepare teachers and aides to meet the needs of all students. And then in regards to curriculum and instruction, when we look at the Common Core State Standards, these are skills and knowledge expected from K through 12 students. What are the implications for students with exceptionalities? And just like the No Child Left Behind laws, the Common Core standards are becoming a problem lately and are not being focused on as much as they were when they were first instituted. We also want to make sure that we take a strengths-based approach rather than a deficit approach. And this is part of how IEPs are set up. So we focus on what the child can do and then build on that. Also, we want to make sure we implement UDL, or the Universal Design for Learning. And with this, we would have multiple ways to access information for the child multiple methods of interacting with the information, and multiple ways to demonstrate understanding of the information. Also, technological assistance is another aspect. Assistive technology would be designed primarily to allow the student with exceptionalities to gain access to information. Some examples of assistive technology are hearing aids, communication boards, audiobooks. Instructional technology would be developed primarily as a means to deliver content and instruction in appropriate manner to students with exceptionalities, for example, with specific computer learning programs. So things we need to keep in mind as we go through this process is cultural differences and exceptionalities. So culture and language can result in biases in assessment. So we need to really keep this in mind as we're carrying out assessments. There can be potential misunderstandings between school and home culture. And this is in the assessment process or in the process of implementing IEPs or least restrictive environments. And then the RTI model may address these inadequacies. So it's a way that we can solve these issues in screening for culturally and linguistically diverse students and can provide supports for students who are struggling academically but don't qualify for special services. So accountability. How do we assess the effectiveness of special education programs? Are they doing what the law says they must do? Well, we can do that through assessment in RTI, in Tier 1 with universal screenings and diagnostic testing, in Tiers 2 and 3 through progress monitoring. We can use performance assessments using a more traditional approach, and this would be measuring a child's ability through normed and standardized testing. And normed just means that it's compared to an average, and standardized just means it's carried out with a specific format. And this is their ability compared to an established group following specific procedures. And then authentic assessment would be measuring a child's abilities through classroom observation and then classroom work. So if we use both performance assessment and authentic assessment, we can get a better picture of how effective programming is. So then also there's the transition to work or advanced education. So transition services included in the IEP of all students 16 and up. And transition services are designed to help students move from school to either work or advanced education.